Hey guys, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Anchor. Now that it's my second year of podcasting, I thought you all should know that I've only used Anchor to record all of my podcasts. And if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's simply the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There are so many creative creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your own cell phone and your own computer. Anchor then does the hardest part for you. They go ahead and distribute your podcast so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so many other platforms. Now, I think it's everything you need to make your own podcast in one place. So what are you guys waiting for? Go ahead and download the free Anchor app today and head on over to anchor.fm to get started. Have fun. Hey everyone, welcome back to all my listeners. Now I hope you're all having a great day so far. I know I am. Now as I'm recording this episode, the Winter Olympics are over. They were so awesome, so fun, so thrilling. They're my very favorite, hands down. And I can't wait to see Paris for the Summer Olympics coming up next and the Milano Cortina Winter Games in 2026. And what's all this I'm hearing about the CDC here in the US easing COVID-19 masking guidelines? I know my city and state are planning on easing up in the next few days under certain circumstances and in certain locations. So please keep aware of your state guidelines as well. Now, if this is your first time finding me, thanks so much and welcome. Welcome to episode 8 of my 5th season. Today is Wednesday, February 23rd, 2022. My name is Sonal Patel, and this is the Paint the Medical Picture podcast series. Now, all right, guys, I have a bit to get into today. So let's start. I'm going to be diving into my compliance tip today on surgical dressings. And hey, you know, it's the last Wednesday of the month, and it's my very favorite month-end episode where I discuss highlights from the month of February's criminal and civil enforcement cases involving fraud, waste, and abuse. And I go ahead and round out today's episode with a remarkable quote on clarity and focus from Hippocrates. If you've checked me out on LinkedIn, you know I'm all about compliance and protecting our physicians and valued healthcare professionals when it comes to the business of medicine. I hope this week with me brings you enough to take back to your organizations, to want to dive in deeper, to use my tips and best practices to ensure success. I hope this podcast will help you boost the quality of documentation capture and improve coding accuracy as you help your providers paint the medical picture. If you like what you're hearing, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss another episode. Please write in a review and kindly drop me a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to my podcast. I'd really love your support. And as always, a friendly disclaimer. Remember, I'm bringing you the news, current healthcare industry news, my compliance tips and recommendations based on my over 10 years of experience in front office, back end, coding, and billing for multi-specialty physicians, compliance, and auditing for both E&M and surgical operative reports. These are my opinions alone and are not to be construed as legal advice. So, let's get into Newsworthy, the month's fraud, waste, and abuse cases. The month of February saw 25 cases as of the recording of this episode. Early February saw a disturbing case in North Carolina where a clinical psychologist was sentenced to 52 months in prison for allegedly defrauding Virginia Medicaid of at least $544,000 and change by creating false diagnoses and false medical records for Medicaid recipients who were mostly minors, as well as falsely representing to Virginia Medicaid that he was providing those minors with mental health services. Now, according to court documents, this licensed clinical psychologist hired a co-conspirator who wrote fictitious patient medical records as if the clinical psychologist had performed actual therapy. And this co-conspirator then created inapplicable diagnoses like depression, anxiety, attention deficit disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder to give the appearance of actual treatment by the clinical psychologist. Now, these mostly minor victims were unaware of the false and fictitious diagnoses the clinical psychologist was inventing and applying to them. Now, let's move on. Early February also saw yet another disturbing case in the state of New Jersey. Here, a former licensed practical nurse, an LPN, was indicted for allegedly committing reckless manslaughter. And there was another party involved in this case. There was also a registered nurse, an RN, who was also indicted for allegedly falsifying a record at a nursing and rehabilitation center related to a patient's medical care. Both the LPN and RN were charged, the following indictment returned by a grand jury. Now, for one count of second-degree reckless manslaughter, the grand jury indictment found that this LPN committed manslaughter, reckless manslaughter, by causing the death of an individual. Now, there was also a fourth-degree destruction, falsification, or alteration of records relating to medical care. The grand jury indictment alleged that the RN purposefully falsified a medical record relating to the medical care of a patient at the nursing and rehab center. Now, mid-February, we see yet another disturbing case, but this time in the state of California. Here, the California Attorney General announced the sentencing imposed upon a caretaker for elderly and dependent persons. Now, this caretaker allegedly sexually assaulted 3 elderly dependents and stole personal property, including money, jewelry, and a handgun. Now, in the Superior Court in California, this man was sentenced to 14 years and 4 months in prison, which is one of the longest elder abuse sentences imposed in a case brought by the California Department of Justice. This caretaker's girlfriend was also a co-defendant and was previously sentenced to 2 years of felony probation for her involvement in the theft scheme. As part of his sentence, this caretaker will be ordered to pay restitution because he pled guilty to 11 felonies relating to sexual assault, financial and elder abuse, as well as theft. The girlfriend also pled guilty to multiple felonies relating to her involvement in the theft scheme. And let's move on. Along these same lines in California, there was another disturbing case. An investigation by the California Department of Justice revealed that a facility administrator at a nursing home convinced a victim to provide checks totaling over $272,000 to which she had no right in collecting. Now, this facility administrator's sister also assisted with the theft because she allowed those large amounts of stolen monies to be deposited into her own personal bank accounts. Now, the victim subsequently passed away from serious health issues in the nursing home. And in her final will and trust, the victim requested to donate 50% of the proceeds of her estate to Doctors Without Borders USA and 50% more to Shriners Hospital for Children, located in Northern California. Now, the defendant's fraudulent actions significantly deprived the victim of these final wishes. As part of the sentencing agreement, both defendants were required to immediately pay $240,000 back into the victim's estate, and the facility administrator will be required to pay back the remaining amount while serving probation. The entire amount of approximately $272,000 will ultimately be paid back to the victim's estate and distributed to the 2 charities listed in the victim's will and trust. Now, of course, there were also many of the usual suspects that I showcase from month to month, like more opioids distributors, more overprescribing, more kickbacks, more bribery schemes, more compound drug schemes, fraudulent DME billing, and money laundering. But I wanted to pay particular attention to a case involving a Florida Medicare reimbursement consultant and his medical billing and consulting company. Now, this man has agreed to pay $50,000 to resolve allegations that he and his company violated the False Claims Act. This particular settlement resolves allegations that the consultant and his company caused the submission of false claims to Medicare because of kickbacks to Medicare patients and because these patients were ineligible to receive glucometers. Now, this particular settlement is based on the United States analysis of financial disclosures made by the company. Now, in its complaint, the United States alleged that from the years 2008 until 2017, this consultant and his company provided consulting services to a now defunct diabetic testing supplier and its parent companies. From the years at least 2009 until 2011, the consultant allegedly served effectively as the head of reimbursement at the diabetic testing supplier, overseeing their reimbursement department, developing their policies for the collection of patient copayment obligations, and submitting claims to Medicare on the supplier's behalf for diabetic testing supplies. Now, the United States alleged that as consultants to the DME supplier from April 2010 until the end of 2016, the consultant and his company knowingly caused the submission of claims to Medicare that were tainted by the payment of kickbacks to Medicare patients in the form of, number one, free or no cost glucometers, or two, the routine waiver of patient copayment obligations. Now, additionally, the United States also alleged that the consultant and his company knowingly caused the submission of claims to Medicare for glucometers on behalf of patients who were not eligible to seek reimbursement because they had already received a meter paid for by Medicare within the previous 5 years. Now, this consultant allegedly often talked about writing off patient copayments to keep his patients satisfied and wrote policies regarding writing off customer copayments. All right. Wow. That was a whopping month of disturbing cases, right? In the entire month of love of February. Love was thrown out the window here with all of this elder abuse that I highlighted. So the month of February was not really very kind, right, at all to our elderly population. There were so many cases this month involving the vulnerabilities so many of our seniors have and the significant physical, emotional, and financial abuses they endure. And of course, the Department of Justice sets its crosshairs on this consultant and his billing and consulting company. Because of these alleged kickbacks that were involved, because of these alleged routine copayment waivers, and because of the alleged bad billing policies, and because of the alleged bad billing practices. And allegedly, there was no integrity here and no consideration for the federal health insurance programs. I do my very best each month trying to highlight those cases I find most interesting. I try my best to provide solid guidance and advice to providers to be mindful of correct coding and compliant billing practices to avoid joining these very serious, these very public, and often very hefty outcomes. I always believe these types of fraud, waste, and abuse cases are most helpful. So please take a deeper look into these reports and see how they may affect you, your provider, and your facility. Start self-auditing your service claims and coordinating documentation to ensure you are meeting compliance. And now it's time for my best practice tips in Trusty Tip. So in today's compliance tip, I wanted to focus on surgical dressings. Surgical dressings are covered under the surgical dressings benefit in the Social Security Act, Section 1861S-5. Now, our CMS Benefit Policy Manual in the Internet-Only Manual 100-02, Chapter 15, Section 100, provides interpretive guidance to our contractors for the implementation of this provision. Now, the relevant part of the manual section establishes two separate benefit criteria. The first is for the necessity for and the definition of a qualifying wound. And the second is for the requirements necessary for any product to be classified as a surgical dressing for purposes of coverage under this benefit. So let's start with the qualifying wound criteria. Now, surgical dressings are covered when a qualifying wound is present. So what does that mean? A qualifying wound is defined as either of the following items. The first is if that wound is caused by or treated by a surgical procedure. Or second, that qualifying wound is defined as after debridement of the wound, regardless of the debridement technique. Now, the surgical procedure or debridement must be performed by a treating practitioner or other qualified healthcare professional to the extent permissible under their state law. Now, debridement types of wounds can be of these four types. There's a surgical type, a mechanical type, a chemical type, and an autolytic type. Now, the surgical type of debridement is through the use of either a sharp instrument or a laser. Mechanical debridement can involve irrigation or wet to dry dressings. Chemical debridement can involve topical application of enzymes. And finally, autolytic debridement can involve the application of occlusive dressings to an open wound. Now, dressings used for mechanical debridement to cover chemical debriding agents or to cover wounds to allow for autolytic debridement are covered, although be mindful that the debridement agents themselves are non-covered, right? So some other clinical examples of where it's non-covered. For example, in the drainage of a cutaneous fistula, which has not been caused by or treated by a surgical procedure. That is not considered to be qualified. There's also a stage 1 pressure ulcer. That's not a qualifying wound. Or a first-degree burn. That's also not qualifying. Or wounds caused by trauma which do not require surgical closure or debridement at all. That's not covered. Like if it's just a skin tear or a minor abrasion, that's not qualified. Or if there happens to be an arterial puncture site other than the site of an indwelling catheter or needle, that's also not covered. That is not qualifying. Now, let's talk about some qualifying dressing requirements. So, products that are eligible to be classified as a surgical dressing are defined as either primary dressings or secondary dressings. Now, primary is defined as therapeutic or protective coverings applied directly to wounds or lesions, either on the skin or caused by an opening to the skin. And then the definition for secondary is for those materials that will serve a therapeutic or protective function and are needed to secure the primary dressing. So some of those items could include adhesive tape or rolls of gauze or rolls of bandages or perhaps disposable compression materials. These are examples of secondary dressings. Now, let's be mindful, though, that there's a whole laundry list of items that happen to not be covered or considered to be a primary or secondary dressing at all. And these would include items like your skin sealants or skin barriers, your wound cleansers or irrigating solutions. Those are not considered to be primary or secondary dressings. Or your solutions used to moisten the gauze like saline. That's not covered. Or your silicone gel sheets. Those are not covered. Or your topical antiseptics, or your topical antibiotics, or your enzymatic debriding agents. Those are not covered. Or any type of first aid, adhesive bandage, any type of your Band-Aids. They might happen to have the ointment of Neosporin on it. That's not covered as well. So we have to be very mindful of what is applicable and what is not applicable for reimbursement. And then, of course, another helpful compliance reminder involves the facts that if a treating practitioner applies surgical dressings as part of a professional service that is billed to Medicare, then the surgical dressings are considered incident to the professional service of that healthcare practitioner, and they're not separately payable. So claims for these types of dressings must not be submitted. Claims for the professional service, which includes the dressings, must be submitted to the local carrier. But however, if those dressing changes are sent home with the patient, claims for these types of sent home dressings may be submitted. And in this case, be mindful to not use the place of service for office, which is 11. You should be using the place of service which corresponds to the patient's home. Now, let's move on. What about documentation for all of this, right? So there are most certainly policy-specific requirements. So policy-specific documentation requirements. So in addition, let's be mindful, there's of course the whole laundry list that I've discussed in previous episodes, in prior seasons, for documentation requirements applicable to DME POS policies, right? So you have to keep that in mind as well. But for this particular surgical dressing policy-specific documentation requirement, a new order is in fact needed if there's a new dressing that's added, or if the quantity of an existing dressing is to be used or increased, right? So a new order is in fact required every 3 months for each dressing being used. And when the prescribing practitioner is also the supplier and is permitted to furnish specific items of DME POS, a separate order is not required. However, be mindful that the medical record must still contain all of the required order elements, right? So you can't skip that step. So for your initial wound evaluations, the treating practitioner's medical record in the nursing home or home care nursing records must specify all of these things. Number one, the type of qualifying wound, right? What kind of wound is it, which I discussed earlier, and also the information regarding the location, the number of wounds, and the size of the qualifying wounds being treated with a dressing. And also include whether the dressing is being used as a primary or secondary dressing, or for something that's non-covered, right? Like you're just cleansing that wound. And you should also be talking about the amount of drainage in the medical record. And you should also talk about the type of dressing, right? Like, is it a hydrocolloid wound cover? Is it a hydrogel wound filler? Talk about the type of dressing that you're trying to use. And also the size of the dressing. Use those measurements if that's applicable, as well as the number and amount to be used at one time, as well as the frequency of the changes you'll be making for those dressings to keep everything clean and sanitized and sanitary, as well as any other relevant and clinical information. And be mindful that your clinical information needs to demonstrate the reasonableness and the necessity, right? Those requirements in the policy regarding the type and the quantity of surgical dressings provided. They must be present in the medical records. And be mindful this information should be updated, right, by the treating practitioner on a monthly basis. And this evaluation of the patient's wounds is required unless there is documentation in the medical record which justifies why that particular evaluation could not be done within that particular time frame of 1 month, right? And what other monitoring methods were in fact used to evaluate the patient's need for the ongoing use of dressings. Now, the weekly or monthly evaluation must include the type of each wound. Again, is it a surgical wound? Is it a pressure ulcer? Is it a burn, etc.? And then talk about the wound location. Where is it? On the bottom of the foot, on the back? Where is the location? Talk about the size. You have to measure it, the length and the width and the depth. And then talk about the amount of drainage, as well as any other relevant wound status information. Now, there's so much more granular detail that you too can find in the local coverage article for surgical dressings for the DME Max of CGS Administrators LLC and Noridian Healthcare Solutions LLC. So please take a deeper look into it because it's chock full of relevant information. It's vital to capture full and robust documentation to ensure you are meeting the medical necessity from the very start. So start by understanding your wound care coding and your surgical dressing applications. So a better, smarter approach is one that's proactive and starts by painting a clear, rich, and vibrant medical picture the first time, so your certified medical coder can then abstract codes with accuracy. And finally, I focus Season 5 Spark on clarity and focus. I want this 5th season Spark to be filled with the world's thought leaders, writers, artists, philosophers, everyone who inspires the need for clarity and focus in all that we do. So, in this week's inspiring quote in Spark is from the father of modern medicine, Hippocrates. The chief virtue that language can have is clarity. So very true, right? I think this is an amazing quote that reminds us, inspires us that our words bring about clarity. It's all about language and communication. Clarity can only be gained if our language is precise and focused. I am happy Hippocrates' spark still burns brightly in all of us today. So that wraps up today's episode. And as always, I appreciate you all diving into today with me. If you want more information from me, please go ahead and follow me on LinkedIn. I'll leave links to everything in the show notes below. Please have an amazing week ahead, and please continue staying safe and healthy. Thank you so much for listening in on today's episode, and I hope every week with me brings you closer to helping your providers paint a masterpiece. See you next Wednesday.